So tonight I recorded this video with the purpose of talking about Dylan Burns and Vosh and general leftist takes about foreign policy, which actually are like more imperialist than they want to admit. But as I was recording, I was like 40 minutes into it and I was like, I have just talked about Dylan Burns and Taiwan for like 40 minutes. There's no way I can record this as one video. So I'm splitting it up. I'm talking about Taiwan in this video. I'm not talking about North Korea. And like I said, I wanted to do them both because Japan and the US relationship with Japan and, you know, post-war Japan is very influential in how people in Korea, North Korea specifically, and China view both of these issues. But hopefully we'll get around to that tomorrow. I don't know if I'm going to do that video. I'm planning to do it tomorrow, but we'll see what happens. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about one Dylan Burns video that he made on Taiwan. Now, I don't watch this guy much, but why I've become aware of his take on Taiwan is because Bad Empanada made a video on it. I've seen him calling out Hasan on Twitter. Someone retweeted that on my timeline, and then he also did a debate. Is it Jason Hinkle, that guy who thinks you can be a patriotic socialist. And while I don't think he doesn't know anything about Taiwan, doesn't know anything about China, but my main problem is he seems to think anyone criticizing his stance on Taiwan and how that fits into general US imperialism in the region is just, you know, throwing out skeleton keys, as he likes to call it, just saying that to try and like do this massive criticism where they're not actually responding to a lot of his points on policy, for example. So I want to talk about that today. And I guess my main point as well, I want to talk about how Chinese people have historically felt about Taiwan and my own experience in terms of how I feel about like a settler colonial nation in the past with Northern Ireland and how I feel about that as an Irish person. So I'm going to get into all of that today. Before we go any further, I'm going to plug my Patreon and social media for about a minute, so skip that if you're not interested. Before we get any further, a lot of my work on this channel is demonetized because when you're covering more serious, sometimes edgier topics, YouTube doesn't like this. So if you've ever enjoyed my work, please consider becoming a patron. And you don't have to pledge a crazy amount. I want to build up my Patreon based on as many people as possible, pledging little amounts like $1 or $2. So if you feel like I have ever brought anything that's worthwhile into your life and my content, please really consider becoming a patron to help me continue to do this regardless of if YouTube monetize or not most of my videos in a given month. Also, if you want to join our communities, come check out our Discord and my subreddit. Those links in the description. And if you want to follow me personally, please check out the Kavernacle at Twitter, at Instagram, and also my personal Reddit where you can keep up to date with all my content and what I'm doing. For every 5k, we get a new chocolate orange. Help me get 2 more before the end of the year. And also I live stream 2 times a week, so that is all archived in the Kavernacle Extra. So a bit of background about me quickly and why I want to say this stuff is just to outline how I feel about colonialism and historic colonialism. But first of all, my educational background, I have a degree in history and I have a master's in international relations. I'd say I pretty much have specialised in US foreign policy. I wrote my history dissertation on the Carter administration's foreign policy, including normalizing relations with China, including things, obviously like Taiwan, which are a big sticking point in those relationships. And then I wrote my master's dissertation on the US media and the First Gulf War. So, I love this stuff. I've covered it a lot. And also I've done modules on things like China, done original research on Korea and the Vietnam War and stuff like that. So yeah, I really like this stuff. And in terms of my personal background, many members of my family historically have fought in Irish independence movements, revolutionary movements. One of my most famous relatives is Sean MacDiarmada, or in English, Sean McDermott, who planned and participated in the Easter Rising in 1916, actually helped draft the proclamation declaring, Irish independence essentially. And this is largely recognised as the beginning of the end of British rule in the south of Ireland. And my relative had polio, he couldn't actually fight, and he nearly got away actually in this defeat, but was spotted by a traitor and someone, part of the British establishment, and he was one of the last people to be executed for the Easter Rising. Now, other members of my family, I think my great-great-granddad, he was in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and he actually went to South Africa to fight the British with the Boers in the Second Boer War. And then I just have generally, I think my grandma, who's 91, who I saw like the other day, I think some of her brothers were in the IRA in the 1940s, part of like these initial waves going over to Northern Ireland to like stir up stuff there. And how I view Northern Ireland generally, you know, I don't want Northern Ireland to exist as a country. I want the whole of Ireland to be, you know, one country led by the Republic. Obviously, more, you know, representation for the North, of course, in this Republic of Ireland. And the IRA obviously believed in one Ireland. That's, you know, why they were fighting in Northern Ireland. And the political settlement, which was the Good Friday Agreement, recognises the will of the Irish people to become one day. And of course, with the way things are going in Northern Ireland, it's trending towards more that if there was a referendum in like, I don't know, next 5 years, we are looking at a situation where Northern Ireland could, in theory, in my lifetime, hopefully become part of the Republic of Ireland. Now, I don't like the Republic of Ireland's government, and even if Northern Ireland didn't want to become part of the Republic, I'd still want that. Now, I want you to keep that in mind when we start talking about China, because what Northern Ireland, you know, represents to me is this Protestant supremacy, this British supremacy, this settler colonial nation, which has, you know, existed by force by the British Empire, and is a reminder to everyone in Ireland that this country next door to Ireland has treated you, the Irish people, us, the Irish people, like garbage, oppressed us, made us second-class citizens in our own country, and Northern Ireland is just a reminder of that. That's like stolen land, and Northern Ireland specifically, you know, even in my head, growing up, I don't even consider Northern Ireland part of Ireland when it is. Like places like Armagh, that's what St. Patrick was literally the bishop of. So as someone who has a family who are in these Irish revolutions, yes, I want Northern Ireland to be a part of Republic of Ireland. And no, I don't really care what a lot of these Protestants think of that stuff. And of course, I don't want the Republic of Ireland to invade. I don't want more violence. But at the end of the day, even if most Northern Irish people didn't want it, I still would, because of my family history and my views on that stuff. And again, keep that in mind when we're talking about Taiwan. So basically, all this stuff started when Hasan was basically criticizing the US for another arms deal with Taiwan.
Now is literally because we have been escalating tensions against China by beefing up Taiwan, giving Taiwan, what is it, like $1.8 billion worth of arms? Like, what is this, dude? Yo, I'm gonna keep it at 100, okay? I'm gonna keep it real. Why don't we do this for Hawaii? Like, what would happen if China was just like, you know what? We're just going to give Hawaii $1.8 billion worth of fucking drones so that the indigenous population there can fucking defend itself. Okay? Which would be a little bit more justifiable than what the fuck we're doing here.
Now, Dylan Burns got mad about this, saying that it was basically defensive arms and everything. It wasn't a provocation. It's so Taiwan can defend itself. Now, I'm going to be fair to Dylan Burns, and I'm going to outline his position fairly, because I don't want it to come across like I'm trying to slander him or mischaracterize him. Basically, he supports Taiwan. He also supports Taiwanese independence. Taiwanese independence isn't something, you know, that common in many nations in the world. They support the One China policy, including the United States, but other minor nations do support Taiwan and recognize it as an independent country. Dylan has recognized how brutal the nationalist government were in Taiwan. He has recognized the awful atrocities they carried out on its own citizens. He's also voiced support for reunification if it's a democratic process done in Taiwan. So basically, his main point is he wants the will of the Taiwanese people to be fulfilled, and he likes it as this, you know, so-called liberal democracy as well. But the one thing I've noticed in Dylan's coverage of Taiwan is that he constantly downplays and simply ignores criticism of his takes, basically pushing US imperialism, not calling him an imperialist himself, but how his arguments often play into these general, I guess, strategies by the US that are, in my opinion, imperialism. So he initially defends the arms sales, saying it's like the status quo. So the status quo is not provocative. It's been, you know, arms sales since the 1970s and 1980s. Hasan is wrong for saying there shouldn't be arms sales to Taiwan.
The second part that I wanted to answer to was the idea that it was an escalation. If this is a continuation of a policy that we have done for 40 plus years, then that's not an escalation. That's a continuation of the status quo.
And then quite quickly later in the video, he responds to the first tweet saying that he's being imperialist, calling it this skeleton key, essentially, and not actually engaging with the argument that supporting Taiwan unequivocally like he's doing is obviously what US imperialism needs to thrive a bit more, which I'm going to get into a bit later.
Taiwan is not the US, and it is imperialist and colonialist for the US to be in the region in this way. Imperialism and colonialism, right? These are words that have meaning, and their meaning should be analyzed. Like, okay, are we talking about imperial cores? And okay, what are we looking at this through a Leninist framework? None of that really matters for what I'm about to say, right? I feel that some people, when it comes to the use of these words, particularly individuals like this, when this is all they post and like that's it, they use it like a skeleton key. Like they hear a position and they just throw this at it and it's done. The same way that I know that I'll say a position like, well, you know what? The Iraq war was terrible. It was awful. There was really not many benefits to this war, that the cost was too heavy, both in human lives and money, and I go through this instability in the region, and someone will be like, anti-American, and just throw the skeleton key at me. And in this way, they throw the skeleton key at me. Imperialist and colonialist. You need to then explain why this is bad. You can't just throw the word at it and be like, that's it. Because the reasons why I support Taiwan isn't because it's anti-imperialist or anti-colonialist, or it helps bring about an age of multipolarity, or whatever concept you would for supporting any other conflict, or whatever you are interested in foreign policy. The reasons I want to support Taiwan are varied, and you're not going to counter any of those reasons with this type of an argument.
So Dylan also makes his stance quite clear. He later goes on to say that, British colonialism in China was very bad, the White Terror was very bad, but he only cares about what Taiwan, wants right now, essentially.
If you think the anthem law is crazy, you should have seen the British opium laws when they ruled. Yeah, you want to know what? The British were terrible when it comes to Hong Kong. The British were terrible when it comes to neocolonialism. The White Terror in Taiwan was terrible. But you know what? Ask the people of Taiwan what they want right now. Because that's what's most important to me. That is what's most important to me.
But I feel like generally with a lot of Americans, what you get is one side of the equation. So for Dylan, Taiwanese self-defense and everything can't really be about imperialism. It's good, essentially. It's keeping China away, and China is very bad, and it's this authoritarian. So when confronted about this a bit on these tweets he's reading out, he starts talking about the imperialism argument a tiny bit more. People saying he's naive for supporting Taiwan in this way, pretty much unequivocally. And he basically says that while US foreign policy goals are a contributing factor to their support of Taiwan, it's not like the be-all and end-all, essentially.
It's never about self-defense, though. America's been cranking up the tensions with China and Taiwan's part of the jig. As a neighbor for the US to throw weapons at, it has nothing to do with self-defense. China, however, is justified in defending itself against imperialism. Cope. Okay, again, skeleton key. Well, let's talk about this part, right? And I'm sorry I'm going through all of this, but this is the best way to deal with criticism, is to take it head on, because I don't like to dodge criticism. It's never about self-defense, though. It is, though. Listen to the rhetoric of the Chinese mainland, of the government in Beijing. Hell, we just saw the interview yesterday of the former interpreter to Deng Xiaoping talking about, look, Taiwan has two options. They're going to be reunified. It's either going to be peacefully or by force, but they're going to be reunified. And if somebody's threatening you that manner, and they have a genuine strategic and long-term interest in invading your territory, then you do need to acquire weapons for self-defense. If America started to ramp up rhetoric and ramp up its military and getting ready for an invasion of, say, well, I guess really any country, it would be in that nation's interests to get weapons for self-defense. So it is about self-defense. Now, is it for self-defense for everybody involved? No, and this is the part that I think people have difficulties with. Is I think when people say that I have this position, they then assume a naivete. And what I mean by that is they assume a naivete as they're like, do you really think that those strategic planners here, or those institute dogs, or those Yankees or whatever, right? Any of them care about the people of Taiwan? Do you think they care about their self-defense or self-determination? This is all purely imperialist interests in advancing the United States against China. You want to know what? That is a contributing factor. There are most certainly strategic planners who look at Taiwan as nothing more than a pawn in a larger board game in Asia. In fact, many of those people who saw Taiwan as a pawn in a larger board game in Asia considered throwing them under the bus on many occasions. The Truman administration is a great example of that. Hell, there's a reason that the Taiwan Relations Act passed was because Jimmy Carter was going forward with normalizations when it came to the Chinese government, and it passed in reaction to that because Congress and among the American people, it was very popular to continue to support the Taiwanese government. At the time, still a dictatorship. And after they liberalized more, it became much easier for people like me to make the argument, well, I believe they should have the right to rule themselves.
So while he recognises a lot of people in US foreign policy establishments see Taiwan as simply a pawn against the Chinese, he kind of, in my mind at least, very much undermines this. He later goes on to say that China is the escalator in the scenario, not the US.
I would say when it comes to Taiwan, largely though, and people can debate me on this, and this is something that you could maybe actually move me off of. This is a genuine admission that you could move me possibly off this. I think the primary escalator when it comes to Taiwan is China. They're the ones violating their airspace. They're the ones making direct military threats. They're the ones doing practice drills, raiding the presidential palaces of Taiwan.
And I feel like, in my opinion, a lot of Western leftists, specifically American leftists, have this tunnel vision, right? Where, China is the escalator because of the last couple of years of history. And I know he is obviously talking about contemporary politics, but it doesn't recognize the significance of Taiwan as this provocative state backed by the US. How that is factored into Chinese-Taiwanese relations or currently Chinese-US relations. So in this video, he doesn't engage with the imperialism debate even further. And he also says he loves his country and everyone should support arming Taiwan.
Yeah, I love my country. It's a problematic country, but yeah, I love it. Cope. I don't care. I never said that leftists should be in support of a policy. I said, in my opinion, I never even said this or that group should be in support of a policy. I think everyone should be in support of this policy. Literally everyone. I'm not just aiming my arguments at leftists, okay? And the reason I brought up the law wasn't saying this law is the reason why we should continue to support them, even though I don't want another reason why we shouldn't backstab them is I don't think America should just look like bastard backstabbers like we have for, well, ever. The reason I made that argument was because Hasan said that this was an escalation. But if it's a law that's been in place and a policy we've had since 1979, then that's not an escalation. That's the status quo. That's quite literally not what an escalation is. If something's the status quo, it can't be an escalation. He literally said, because the US passed a law saying that we're best friends with Taiwan, we're automatically correct and not imperialist. I never said that. When did I say that? You Ron, I never said that. Who are you? But I never said that because we passed the law, we're automatically correct and not imperialist. I never claimed that I didn't have hints of imperialism or wasn't imperialistic in any way. Okay? There's many empires in the world. All I said was that the idea, number one, I asked him a clarifying question on if he thinks that we should not, if he thinks that we shouldn't provide Taiwan with military arms to defend itself. That's the first thing I asked him directly. And the second thing was, hey, this can't be an escalation by definition. Nobody wants to engage with what I said. Nobody.
So I don't think Dylan is a bad guy for wanting this for Taiwan and wants, more arms sales and military equipment and all that stuff. But also people like Dylan, I feel, are quite useful idiots. I'm not calling him an idiot, but I feel like he carries water from imperialism through this tunnel vision because it's the same arguments that, of course, neoconservatives have used in the past. You got to back democracies no matter what. And they, you know, as Dylan will learn, I think he's actually doing an international relations degree. As Dylan will learn if he ever studies like realism in international relations, is that massive powerful states often just say this type of stuff as justification for imperialism because they never actually care about this stuff. And in the case of the United States, this is true like, I don't know, 99% of the time, that they don't care about democracy, human rights, or they never enforce this consistently. And that's how you can get them backing Saudi Arabia and doing arms deals with them, while at the same time putting sanctions on Nicaragua for buying weapons off Russia. So I'm going to get back to how Taiwan does serve as part of imperialist US policy. But the final point of the video is that Dylan essentially says that the status quo with Taiwan at the moment and US defense pacts and selling them loads of weapons and helping them military equipment, this cannot start World War III. And he uses the example of America weirdly backing Egypt against Britain as an example of how when you take quite provocative foreign policy stances, often even in more dangerous times, like the 1950s with the threat of nuclear war and everything like that, it never really materializes. Maybe if you're even saying World War III, you're fear-mongering.
Here's a great example of it. We supported many countries in Western Europe. Hell, we even supported the Egyptian government against British interests and the interests of other allies that didn't like that we supported the Egyptian government. We supported many governments. And you want to know what happened during all those times? During the time we had nuclear bombs and we had these complex alliances, World War III never broke out. Now, that's not to say that World War III could never have broken out. There were many close calls. Most of the times due to human error or the fog of war. But there were many times that it could have happened. So I don't know where this assumption is that if we continue this policy, it's going to automatically start World War III. What I can tell you is this. If we don't support Taiwan, if we retract our support from Taiwan, then I can guarantee you that if the Taiwanese don't accept peaceful reintegration with the mainland, then a war will happen. So who has the anti-war position?
So I do reject that take, and the comparison is pretty ridiculous in the sense that, like, Taiwan and Egypt in the 1950s are not comparable because China wants Taiwan back. Like, Dylan knows this, of course. China wants Taiwan back as part of its country, and it's willing to take military action one day to possibly do that, for example, right? And hot take, if China invade Taiwan, I don't want anyone to do anything. The Taiwanese, of course, can fight for themselves. I don't want the US to come to their aid. I don't want Japan and South Korea as well as part of these defense pacts. I don't want them to come to their aid. Do you know why? Because Dylan seems to think that this stuff couldn't spill over into a wider conflict. So let's say China invades Taiwan. The US fleet launched from the surrounding islands, including like Japan and maybe even South Korea. And then they fight on the seas. Maybe US troops land in Taiwan if Chinese troops are already there. And they start fighting each other. That is a nightmare scenario for the world. Because not only do we have these two massive nuclear world powers fighting each other over this small amount of land, it also gives the potential for other things in the region to kick off. Like, if you are using South Korea and Japan for this war potentially, then how do the North Koreans feel about that? And what is the situation on the Korean border and stuff? And that's why people say supporting provocative stances. Now, I'm going to use the word provocative rather than escalating, which is the one Dylan seems to have a problem with. And this is why it's problematic in general, because Dylan just doesn't support arming Taiwan. He supports their defense as well. And for me, that is imperialism. And let's get to it a bit broader now before we go into the history of how Chinese people feel about Taiwan. So Dylan is probably aware of this, although I haven't actually heard him speak too much about this. But of course, Taiwan is a key part of the US's island chain strategy. So for those of you who haven't heard what this is, and I'm going to get a map for you as well. So the island chain strategy is a geographical security concept crafted by the United States in the 1940s to deter China and the Soviet Union's maritime ambitions. Two island chains in the Western Pacific are noteworthy. The first comprises the Kuril Islands, the main Japanese archipelago, Okinawa, the northern part of the Philippine archipelagos, the Malay Peninsula, and Taiwan. The second chain consists of the islands of Japan, stretching to Guam, and the islands of Micronesia. China has managed to establish a firm presence through its grey zone operations in the first island chain. However, China has yet to establish a permanent presence in Taiwan to take hold of the first island chain completely. So here's the island chain up for you. So here is the first one you can see where Taiwan is essentially the closest to China. But of course, in the island chain, you have Okinawa, historically a US military base after it was conquered by the US in 1945. Obviously, you have Japan, and then you have US military bases in South Korea as well, which of course face the coasts of China too. And you have various other island nations that are allied at least with the US, if not have US troops stationed there. And then you have the second line as well, which goes back all the way to Guam. Now, in this context, it's pretty stark why people view this as imperialism. Here you have China surrounded by US allies where the US have a massive military presence, all facing towards it. And the goal of the US foreign policy at the moment is to contain the rise of China. Since 2008, when they really caught on that China was rising, this has been the goal of US foreign policy. Not to mention, since the 1840s, the US do love playing Japan and China off each other to keep a status quo which directly benefits them. So Dylan's arguments about the status quo not being provocative, I feel like, is a bit naive when the status quo historically since the end of the Second World War has been the complete American domination of the East China Sea, and to a lesser extent, you know, having security in the South China Sea, not to mention massive wars it has fought on China's border in Vietnam and Korea as well. Constant bombing campaigns literally on the doorstep of mainland China. And that gets to my broader issue, because I feel like the US aggressive foreign policy in this region is something that comes back to hurt them. So for me, justifying imperialism just because you like the country that benefits isn't a good argument for me for doing imperialism. So I started this video off talking about me as like an Irish person, someone with an Irish background, how I feel about Northern Ireland. So I just want to talk about how Chinese people feel about Taiwan. I want to talk about what Taiwan means to Chinese people. So Dylan has made this point as well, but Taiwan has always been, you know, in the vicinity of China, lots of trade, lots of people going back and forth between the two territories. It came under direct Chinese control in the late 1600s, and they only lost control in the 1890s when they lost the first Sino-Japanese war, in that Taiwan became a colony of Japan and it became called Formosa. Of course, Japan had to give this back after the Second World War, and of course it was reoccupied by the nationalist Chinese. And then, of course, after the Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek flees there and sets up the Republic of China's government there, and it's internationally recognized. So for Chinese people, not only has Taiwan been taken from them before by Japan, this foe that actually invaded the mainland and inflicted brutal casualties and just war crimes on them, it is then also given to their Western stooge enemy, Chiang Kai-shek, whose family ran that country until the 1980s, and the Nationalist Party are still one of the biggest parties there today. So of course the Chinese people, how does that look to them? Not only does the mainland not control it, it's also still backed by the Americans, who constantly give them weapons. So again, that is just part of the reason why Chinese people hate that. And part of the legitimacy of the Communist Party is, of course, when they came to power, it's like, we're anti-colonial. We are going to overcome this century of humiliation, as they call it in China, from the Opium Wars to the invasion and war against Japan. We're going to overcome that and become this new nation. And we're going to get rid of the shackles of Western and Japanese imperialism and become strong as this new Chinese nation. But Taiwan is just a constant reminder to people in China that this Western colonialism is still something that stops China, in their mind, from being unified. Now, as someone who supports Taiwanese self-determination, I can also, as an Irish person, totally understand why a lot of Chinese people feel this way about Taiwan, because just like Northern Ireland to me, it's a reminder of this brutal colonialism that was inflicted upon you by the West and by Japan. And this is something that, although Mao didn't like to talk about as much, Deng Xiaoping was quite happy to talk about how China suffered during this century of humiliation. So that's what you've got to keep in mind when we're talking about Taiwan in terms of how Chinese people and even the Chinese Communist Party view these things. So for people like Dylan, like the Chinese, I guess, wanting to even do this is a bit nefarious, because it's like, well, Taiwan is this, you know, lovely liberal democracy now. Like, it's not the authoritarian dictatorship it was until the 1980s. But then he has to remember why China won it back in the first place. It's not that all Chinese people are evil and they just want to make Taiwanese people suffer and stuff like that. It's because of how Taiwan came to be as a nation. And like with stuff I was reading today, how the government of China view this stuff, because Chiang Kai-shek used to attack the mainland from Taiwan. It has been an aggressor in part, and the Chinese know about this island strategy that is boxing them in, and Taiwan is the head of that. It's right next to China, and it's part of this broader strategy by the US to stop the rise of China. And as someone who's into international relations, just like Dylan, I don't really view this through moral judgments, because I don't like the Chinese government. I just think it's extremely hypocritical to turn around and dismiss any criticisms of supporting Taiwan in this way as ridiculous, especially when we're talking about imperialism, when it clearly, Taiwan as an entity is literally built on Western imperialism and Japanese imperialism, and then is propped up for the goals of Western, mainly American imperialism, to keep their dominance on the Pacific region, which they have thanks to World War II and its colonization in the Pacific, where it maintains massive troop levels in somewhere which is so far away from home. And if we talk about international relations and we talk about the US talks about national security when Iran is developing a space program. China literally has somewhere which is literally recognized as a part of its country being given weapons by the United States, right? Let's for a moment imagine if China had massive military bases in Latin America and the Caribbean, and constantly maybe, I don't know, funded Puerto Rico or something with military weapons and stuff like that, and they justified it as like a national security thing. That would be ridiculous. But for some reason, when the US do it, it's not ridiculous. They're just entitled to this global role where they can just have their warships all over the place, they can have their troops all over the place, and my main problem with people like Dylan is like, you can support Taiwanese self-determination and you can maybe even support arms sales to them, but I'm saying you have to recognize how this is a provocative action to people in China in general, either who have these nationalist tendencies or are just, still maybe carrying emotional trauma from these periods, whether that be the Japanese invasion, the Civil War, or maybe even its involvement in the Korean War where so many Chinese soldiers died. So you can't just hand wave away criticism and say, anyone who criticizes my takes on Taiwan as carrying water for imperialism or propping up this imperialist system in the world is skeleton key ridiculous. You can't just say that. And like I say, as international relations, you've got to realize from the Chinese perspective how this looks and how it is provocative. And I feel like in my mind, if Taiwan wasn't continually militarized as it is, and the whole region wasn't continually militarized as it is, the reaction from China, I don't think, would be as strong as, yeah, we're going to invade soon. And I think they would have been happier to maintain, as Dylan says, this status quo from the 70s and 80s if the US didn't continue to ramp up tensions in this region by being more provocative, by giving more arms or stationing more troops around this region to contain the rise of China. And also something to keep in mind as well, China was more happy with the status quo because it wasn't becoming this rising superpower where it could actually challenge historic grievances against the US. And that's something to remember. Because the Civil War and everything is quite far away now, we think that maybe doesn't matter, but China has been waiting to become powerful enough to take on the US in a big way. Clearly with the Korean War, it was happy enough to do this, but in terms of like reclaim its like destiny as it views it, it sees Taiwan as a big part of finally overthrowing this colonial legacy. And now, like I said at the start, I don't think it's exactly similar to Northern Ireland, but at the same time, if you said to me that like I'm a bad person for wanting Northern Ireland to be part of the Republic, even if necessarily not everyone in the North wants that, then I don't know what to tell you. To me, what Northern Ireland represents, as I'm sure to a lot of Chinese people, what Taiwan represents, is the legacy of settler colonialism, brutal oppression, and just a whole host of awful things that England has done to Ireland, and for Chinese people, what the West and what Japan has done to China. So the purpose of making this video is not to make Dylan Burns change his mind, because I don't think he's going to change his mind. And I don't really care. My main point was to show you, honestly, how arguments like this, while they can be justifiable for sure, and you can support Taiwanese self-determination, I don't mind that, you just cannot ignore the imperialist nature of these things. And you cannot ignore this stuff. And you also, I feel like, as an international relations guy like he is, and I am, you've got to take your own biases out of this stuff. You can't just be like, yeah, give Taiwan whatever they want, and that's good, not imperialism, no benefit for the US imperialism at all, I just want to defend a democracy. You've got to acknowledge both how this is provocative to Chinese people and the Chinese government, and how it actually helps US imperialism. You can't have this tunnel vision where this stuff just exists in a vacuum, where you don't actually realize the consequences of what you're doing and how that might, you know, exacerbate and, as Hasan says, maybe even escalate a situation. And there comes a point where the status quo of US imperialism does become provocative, because that status quo could only exist if the country it was against was weak enough for it to exist. China isn't weak anymore, therefore the status quo has become provocative, because the status quo existed only because that state couldn't compete with the US policy there. Now the US are doing that and more to try and contain this country, and therefore, like, it is provocative. As a final point, it's always funny to me how Americans talk about Taiwan. I'm not talking about Dylan, I'm just talking about the Americans in general. When the Chinese arguments for Taiwan being a part of their country are like way more legit and recognizable than Hawaii being a part of America. Just something to keep in mind about the hypocrisy of the world when you view it from an American imperialist lens. But anyway, let me know what you guys think down in the comments. If you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to support my work, check out my Patreon. If you want to join our communities, check out the Discord and the subreddit. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.